Hi, and welcome to Creepy Crime Story, where the darkest truths aren't imagined. They're real. You don't expect to hear a skull's name 4 decades later. You especially don't expect it to belong to the girl who vanished on the 4th of July. But in 2022, the bones finally spoke. And in 2025, so did the law. On July 4th, 1983, the residents of Selma, Oregon, gathered for fireworks, food, and the kind of community gathering small towns still held on to. Among them was 27-year-old Teresa Joanne Peroni, blonde, confident, and quietly rebuilding her life after some personal setbacks. She'd recently ended a prior relationship, was living with her mother, and had been dating a man named Mark Sanfratello. That night, the two were seen arriving together at a small outdoor party off Illinois River Road, a forested stretch along the water, known more for hiking and campfires than anything sinister. Witnesses described the evening as unremarkable at first. Teresa mingled, chatted. Mark, 29 at the time, appeared tense. One attendee would later recall him as jealous-looking and hovering. Around 9:30 p.m., the couple was seen arguing near their parked vehicle. By 10:15, they had both walked into the woods. By 10:30, only one of them had come back. Teresa was never seen again. Her car remained parked near the river. Her purse and shoes were inside. No signs of a struggle were reported in the immediate area. There was no blood, there was no scream, there was no body, and without a body, there was no crime. Mark Sanfratello told deputies that Teresa had stormed off into the woods alone after their argument. He claimed he waited a while, called out for her, then assumed she wanted space. No 911 call was made. He didn't notify Teresa's mother. He drove home the next morning. The initial police report, filed July 6, 1983, stated that Teresa was missing under suspicious but non-criminal circumstances. A BOLO was issued across county lines. Her name went into a statewide missing persons database. The car was processed, but no physical evidence of foul play was found. At that time, without a body or evidence of violence, prosecutors were reluctant to move forward. There was no indictment, no arrest, no charges. What was left behind, however, was a growing sense that something had gone deeply wrong, and that someone knew more than they were saying. Over the next few weeks, search crews combed the area surrounding the Illinois River. Dogs were brought in, helicopters scanned from above, divers searched the deeper bends. Nothing turned up. The terrain was dense, but locals knew it well. They began to speculate. Some thought she'd simply walked away from her life. Others weren't so sure. By August 1983, public interest had faded. The town moved on. The file went cold. But Teresa's family didn't. Her mother, Patricia Peroni, kept her daughter's room untouched. She called the local sheriff's office every year on July 4th, asking if there was any update. Every year, the answer was the same. No leads, no remains, no resolution. In a taped statement given in 1999, Patricia said, "I knew she didn't leave on her own, but people stop listening when you say that for too long." That same year, 1999, a partial skull was found 2 miles from the party site by a hunter walking through the forest. It had been exposed by erosion, sun-bleached, and cracked. The discovery made local news but didn't lead to anything definitive. Technology at the time couldn't confirm identity. No DNA match existed in state databases. The remains were classified as unidentified female. The evidence was boxed, logged, and stored. In 1983, the lack of a body protected the suspect. In 1999, the lack of technology protected the secret. It would take until 2022, nearly 40 years later, for both of those barriers to break. Today, July 4th, 2025, the name Teresa Peroni is no longer listed as missing. It is listed as deceased, homicide. She was silent for decades. But when her bones were finally identified, the timeline that had stalled in 1983 began to move again. Fast. The Oregon State Police Cold Case Task Force reopened her file in early 2024 after forensic analysts at the University of North Texas used advanced DNA phenotyping and kinship matching to link the skull to Teresa's maternal family line. They had entered Patricia Peroni's DNA into the federal missing persons database in the late 2000s, long after she died. As part of a broader initiative, It was that entry that finally connected the dots. With the match confirmed in February 2024, the status of the investigation shifted immediately. A 42-year-old missing persons report was now an active homicide case. Forensic anthropologists were brought in to reanalyze the condition of the skull. The damage suggested trauma inconsistent with natural decomposition or animal activity. There were fractures near the occipital bone that experts believed were likely caused by blunt force. The proximity of the skull to the area Teresa was last seen provided investigators with geographical linkage. But what they needed now was behavioral evidence. They needed inconsistencies. They needed records. So they went back to the beginning, to the witness statements, the original interviews, the discrepancies in timelines, and the man who had last seen her alive. By the time they reached him, he was 72, living in Chico, California. Still quiet, still uncharged, still a name that had lived in the margins of the original file. But in 2025, silence was no longer protection. The investigation that began with a skull in a Ziploc evidence bag had finally reopened the most stubborn door in the case, the one that led back to the last person who saw Teresa alive. That's where we'll go next. By the spring of 2024, the skull recovered in 1997 was no longer anonymous. The match to Teresa Peroni had moved the case off the cold file shelf and back into the hands of active investigators in Josephine County. The original reporting officer was long retired. The original case file wasn't digitized. Everything had to be rebuilt. From physical location to the behavioral map of the last night Teresa was seen alive. The starting point wasn't the skull, it was the statement. Mark Sanfratello's 1983 interview, recorded on a microcassette and transcribed by hand, became the focal point. At the time, he told deputies that Teresa had been upset, left on foot into the forest after an argument, and refused to respond to his calls. He stated he waited, then left the area around 11 p.m., returning the next morning to check if she was back. She wasn't. That statement had sat uncontested for over 4 decades. But 2024 brought new tools and a more skeptical lens. Investigators pulled maps of the party location and cross-referenced them with terrain models. The forest surrounding Illinois River Road was rugged. Not the kind of place someone could walk off in sandals and a summer dress without a trace. The slope, distance to the riverbank, and tree density made the idea of voluntarily walking several miles in the dark improbable, especially with no light source and no witnesses seeing her leave alone. More troubling were the inconsistencies when that 1983 statement was read alongside witness accounts from that night, several of which hadn't been re-reviewed since they were written. One attendee, a man named Keith Durbin, noted that after the couple argued, Mark returned to the group later than expected and appeared to have changed shirts. That detail was not flagged in 1983, but now it became relevant. Another witness recalled hearing someone yell, "Get off me," near the tree line, but admitted she wasn't sure who it was and didn't think much of it at the time. That statement, while vague, was reclassified under possible corroboration. Then came the timeline. Mark had claimed he left the area shortly after 11 p.m. However, a man who owned a small gas station on the main road out of Selma gave a voluntary statement in 1983 saying he saw Mark stop in after midnight, agitated and alone. That man was deceased, but the report remained in the file, and while it had been dismissed previously as unreliable, in 2024 it was one of the few fixed timestamps available. The data aligned too cleanly. Sometimes that was the problem, one detective noted in the reopened task force notes. Everything Mark had said in 1983 lacked verification, but also lacked contradiction. In the absence of forensics, his version was simply never challenged, until now. With the new classification of Teresa's remains as a homicide, investigators were authorized to re-interview any surviving witnesses. They started with a woman named Carla Hayes, a close friend of Teresa who'd attended the same party. Carla confirmed that Teresa had been anxious in the days leading up to the 4th. She'd expressed doubts about the relationship, citing controlling behavior and verbal outbursts. Carla remembered Teresa saying, "I don't think he's going to let me go easy." It wasn't physical evidence, but it gave the case a narrative arc prosecutors could start to frame, one that shifted Teresa from a missing person to a likely victim of escalating interpersonal violence. Still, without direct evidence tying Mark to her death, it wasn't enough. That would come next, through a full reconstruction of location data, triangulation of the skull discovery, and expert analysis of the terrain between the site and the original party. But this chapter of the investigation served one primary purpose: to recontextualize the words said in 1983. Because time had changed the meaning of silence. And silence, when reviewed under forensic light, becomes its own kind of noise. The skull was discovered in October 1997. It was lying in a shallow gully off an unmarked trail, roughly 2 miles southwest of where Teresa Peroni was last seen. The area was part of the Illinois River Corridor: dense woods, sporadic foot traffic, and no established campsites nearby. The terrain was unstable, with seasonal erosion and narrow drop-offs, making the location difficult to reach unless someone already knew the paths. At the time of discovery, the bone was recorded as human cranium, adult female. It had no mandible. The maxillary dental structure was incomplete. No hair, clothing, or associated items were found. No obvious trauma marks were noted initially due to the degraded condition. A responding deputy with the Josephine County Sheriff's Office collected the skull and submitted it to the state medical examiner's office, which processed the find under the label Jane Doe, approx. 2530, estimated death, unknown. The site was not cordoned off long. No further remains were uncovered. The partial skull was boxed and archived. That was the forensic context. But context without identification goes nowhere. For 25 years, that skull sat in storage, one of hundreds in Oregon's backlog of unidentified remains. Fast forward to 2022. The Oregon State Police Cold Case Division entered a partnership with the University of North Texas Center for Human Identification to reprocess older unidentified remains using updated mitochondrial DNA techniques. The skull retrieved in '97 was selected for review due to proximity to a historic missing persons case flagged in their system. Teresa Peroni, last seen July 4, 1983, less than 2 miles from the find location. On November 28, 2022, the lab confirmed a match between the degraded DNA from the skull and the maternal DNA profile submitted in 2008 by Patricia Peroni, Teresa's late mother. The match was strong enough to warrant reclassification of the remains. Teresa Joanne Peroni, identified deceased. That one data point, a name placed back on a skull, forced the geography of the case into the center of the investigation. Detectives requested an updated GIS survey of the recovery zone. The new data revealed that the site of the skull was accessible only by a narrow footpath that broke off from a game trail. It was not visible from the main road. There was no direct line of sight to or from any established trailheads. The likelihood that Teresa had simply walked there herself, without a flashlight, in the dark, in July, temperatures averaging below 50 degrees Celsius at night, was deemed highly improbable in the task force's internal assessment. In addition to the logistical obstacles, investigators focused on a specific question. If Teresa had died due to misadventure or suicide, why was only her skull found? No long bones, no clothing, no shoes, no jewelry, not even the smallest trace of a fabric tag or zipper tooth, which under standard decomposition timelines should have persisted in some form unless intentionally removed or scattered. Forensic soil sampling from beneath the original retrieval site was requested in 2024. The results were inconclusive for bodily decomposition, suggesting the skull had likely been placed there after significant time had passed post-mortem, or that the rest of the remains had been relocated, intentionally or by animal activity. However, the area was not known for large scavenger species. The possibility of partial burial or deliberate placement was entered into the report. Investigators reviewed satellite imaging and topographic maps dating back to the late '80s to determine what, if anything, had changed about the terrain. The path was not new. In fact, according to the Forestry Service, it had existed in some form since the 1970s, used mainly by trappers and seasonal campers. That detail carried weight. If the person who left the skull there had chosen that spot, they had to know the area. It wasn't random. There were no signs of flood debris, no indication of natural erosion carrying the remains that far. It had been placed, or dropped, where it was found. What this discovery offered wasn't just confirmation of Teresa's death. It introduced a geographical constraint that investigators hadn't had before. The disposal site was close, hidden, deliberate. It gave weight to the theory that she never left that forest of her own accord, and that someone had returned after the party with the intent to conceal. One of the detectives put it plainly in their report: "You don't place a skull 2 miles from a known event without some knowledge of the terrain." This wasn't accidental exposure. This was a decision. By June 2024, the investigative team had fully reconstructed the topographical profile of both the disappearance site and the recovery location. They could now map the distance, elevation, vegetation density, and visibility. This wasn't just a forest anymore. It was a crime scene with a 4-decade delay. What remained was connecting that landscape to one person, someone who had reason, opportunity, and access in July of 1983. That process had already begun. By early July 2024, the case against whoever was responsible for Teresa Peroni's disappearance was no longer theoretical. Her remains had been identified. The topographical data from the skull recovery site supported the conclusion of intentional placement, and now investigators needed to move beyond physical evidence and examine the behavioral profile behind the crime. Teresa's background had been only briefly sketched in the original file. She was 27 at the time of her disappearance, employed part-time at a local print shop in Grants Pass, and living with her mother after a recent breakup prior to the one that placed her in proximity to the suspect. Those details were static. They didn't explain the events of July 4th, 1983. What mattered now was her final relationship and the dynamics inside it. In July 2024, the task force re-interviewed Carla Hayes, Teresa's longtime friend. Her original statement from 1983 had been brief. She recalled seeing Teresa and Mark arguing at the Independence Day party. Now she provided more detail. She described prior incidents: Teresa showing up to work with small bruises she brushed off as clumsy accidents, and canceling plans on short notice because he didn't like it when I went out without him. Carla said she had encouraged Teresa to leave him more than once. Teresa had responded that she was trying to handle it quietly. These statements weren't just anecdotal. They pointed to a cycle of coercive control that had likely been in place for months. The task force requested any and all prior police contact involving the suspect. The Josephine County Sheriff's Office records from the early 1980s were paper-based, requiring in-person review. What they found was a 1982 report, a domestic disturbance call logged in Cave Junction, involving the suspect and a previous partner. No arrest had been made, and the woman had refused to press charges, but the pattern had started early. Further inquiry into the suspect's record showed that after he moved to California in the late 1980s, he had been arrested twice, once in 1993 for assaulting a cohabiting partner, and again in 2001 for violating a restraining order. While none of these cases resulted in felony convictions, they demonstrated a documented history of controlling and sometimes violent behavior toward women in domestic settings. Investigators also reviewed archived employment records. At the time of Teresa's disappearance, the suspect had been working seasonal construction jobs, many of which were based near the Illinois River corridor. He had personal familiarity with the terrain. He knew the trails, the unpaved service roads, and which areas weren't visible from the highway. In victimology terms, the behavioral markers in Teresa's case fell squarely within the parameters of domestic homicide risk. A recent escalation in control, isolation from support systems, and an attempt to exit the relationship. These are known high-risk indicators. In most modern assessments, they trigger immediate protective response. In 1983, there were no formal protocols, no lethality assessments, no database flags. The system wasn't built to intervene before a body turned up. The reconstruction of Teresa's final weeks suggested someone trying to disengage quietly from a volatile relationship, and potentially underestimating the danger of doing so. When asked why no one spoke up louder at the time, Carla Hayes said something that stuck with the task force. Back then, if you didn't have bruises you couldn't hide, no one really wanted to get involved. That comment reframed the timeline. Not just what had happened, but how much of it had been quietly visible. The task force compiled a full behavioral profile and submitted it to the Oregon Department of Justice for peer review in late July 2024. Their conclusion was straightforward. The relationship Teresa was in during the summer of 1983 had all the classic hallmarks of escalating interpersonal violence. The disappearance, viewed in context with those risk factors, was no longer just a missing persons case. It was statistically predictable. These findings didn't replace forensic evidence, but they gave investigators the narrative foundation needed to demonstrate motive, pattern, and pre-crime behavior. They gave weight to a case that still lacked a confession or eyewitness. And, more importantly, they filled in the parts of the story that forensic soil samples couldn't touch. The human decisions that led to a disappearance no one in 1983 was willing to call a crime. The skull was only the beginning. What mattered next was what surrounded it, or more precisely, what didn't. In June 2024, nearly a year after the case was reopened, a forensic recovery team from Oregon State Police returned to the exact GPS coordinates where the cranium had been found in 1997. The original discovery site had been loosely documented, but technology had since advanced. LiDAR mapping, soil stratigraphy, and advanced particle analysis were used to reprocess the terrain. The goal wasn't just to locate more remains, it was to extract data the human eye missed the first time. They began with grid excavation, 6 square meters around the known site. Topsoil was carefully screened. The area was dry, moderately acidic, and covered in seasonal debris. No large bones emerged, but 2 fragments of weathered synthetic fabric were located 3 feet downslope, caught beneath a bed of pine needles and root clusters. One piece matched a 1980s-era cotton blend commonly used in women's summer dresses. The other was harder to identify, but preliminary lab work confirmed presence of polyester microshed consistent with commercial undergarments of that era. It wasn't conclusive, but it placed textile evidence within range of where Teresa's skull had been recovered. The clothing she wore on July 4, 1983 was last reported by a friend. A blue sundress, thin straps, no sleeves. No photographs existed from that night. That detail, too, had lived only in memory. More useful was what the ground beneath the skull said. Soil pH and nitrate content showed mild disruption, not from decomposition, but from shallow burial followed by surface exposure. That indicated the skull had likely been partially buried at some point before erosion dislodged it. There were no animal tooth marks, no fractures from environmental damage. The lack of scatter suggested it hadn't been randomly dropped, but deliberately placed. More than 4 decades after Teresa vanished, the earth was still yielding fragments. A single rusted earring clasp was recovered just outside the grid line, corroded but intact. Her mother, Patricia, had told deputies back in 1983 that Teresa never left home without that pair. In forensic cases like this, small objects become witnesses, and that clasp, buried just inches from where investigators had stopped digging in 1997, was one of them. The investigative team compiled their findings into a geospatial reconstruction model. It showed an improbable convergence: textile fiber, a bone, and personal jewelry, all within a confined 8-meter radius, all without signs of natural drift or wildlife scatter. The implication was direct. The body had been there, at least partially, at some point, and someone had taken steps to limit what remained. They weren't going to get a full skeleton. Too much time had passed, but they no longer needed it. The forensic reconstruction report, finalized in July 2024, concluded that the skull had been intentionally placed or buried at the scene. The location had not been used recreationally. It showed no signs of foot traffic, campsites, or civilian proximity. It wasn't a place someone stumbled into. It was a place someone led someone else into, or carried her there. For the first time, the case had 3 independent forensic anchors: biological confirmation, DNA, behavioral motive, profiling, and now environmental evidence of intentional concealment. It didn't answer the full how, but it strongly suggested the when and the why had always been misleading. The details weren't flashy. There was no blood spatter, no murder weapon, no dramatic confession. But sometimes silence isn't just the absence of sound. It's the accumulation of what no one bothered to say or dig deep enough to find. By August 2024, the Teresa Peroni case had crossed a threshold. Investigators weren't speculating anymore. They had a verified body, a defined site of concealment, and a behavioral profile that aligned with known risk factors for fatal domestic violence. But evidence, even when consistent, has to clear a high bar to be admissible in court, especially when decades have passed and no direct eyewitness remains. The task force turned its attention to the procedural layer. How to convert patterns into prosecution? They began by compiling all physical findings into a unified timeline. Each piece of data, the DNA-confirmed skull, fabric remnants, soil disruption patterns, and the earring clasp, was plotted against the last known sighting of Teresa. None of it pointed to random accident. Every forensic element supported the conclusion of post-mortem concealment, likely within 24 hours of her disappearance. Still, there were no surveillance tapes in 1983, no cell phone pings, no text records. That kind of absence was standard for the era, but in modern courtrooms it requires preemptive reinforcement. Prosecutors needed more than inference. They needed to eliminate alternate possibilities. So they reopened background tracing on the suspect. Not just criminal history, but residency, employment, and travel movement after the summer of 1983. California records showed that the suspect left Oregon permanently in early 1984, relocating to Chico. He applied for a construction license in May of that year and never returned to the state for extended periods. That post-disappearance departure, while not criminal, was noted as significant by the prosecution team. It aligned with known patterns of geographic distancing, often seen in homicide offenders who avoid detection by leaving jurisdiction. They also obtained subpoenaed financial records from the late 1980s through the early 2000s. Nothing indicated direct evidence of involvement, but there were consistent cash withdrawals and a lack of credit activity during that transition. Investigators flagged it not as a smoking gun, but as another small piece of circumstantial behavior consistent with someone keeping a low profile. With those findings consolidated, the Josephine County District Attorney's Office prepared a preliminary report for a grand jury. Grand juries in Oregon operate in private. They hear evidence, not arguments, and their role is to determine only one thing: whether enough probable cause exists to indict. The challenge in cold cases isn't just evidence, it's juror expectation. Many expect modern tools to deliver modern certainty, but this case would rely on a structured chain of reasoning: the proximity of the skull, the behavioral escalation, the forensic signs of burial, and the absence of any other plausible explanation. Prosecutors didn't frame it around what they couldn't prove. They focused on what had been proven: that Teresa was dead, that she had not left of her own will, and that her remains were found in a place only someone who knew the area could have accessed. In late June 2025, after reviewing hundreds of pages of forensic data, historical witness statements, and expert analysis, the grand jury returned an indictment for murder in the second degree. A warrant was issued. On June 28, 2025, the suspect, now 72 years old, was taken into custody at his home in Chico, California, without incident. The arrest was unremarkable in execution. There were no raised voices, no resistance. But symbolically, it marked a shift. The moment a disappearance turned into a criminal case, and the burden of silence shifted from the victim to the man who had always said too little. By July the 2nd, 2025, just days before the anniversary of Teresa Peroni's disappearance, the man accused of ending her life stood in a Josephine County courtroom for the first time. His hair was thinner, his frame smaller, but what hadn't changed, according to prosecutors, was the silence. He entered the courtroom without speaking to reporters, made no statement to the court, and sat motionless during the reading of the charges. Murder in the second degree. This wasn't a trial, it was a preliminary hearing. The legal objective was narrow: determine whether sufficient evidence existed to move forward with formal prosecution. But for those present, it marked the first public confrontation between the story Teresa's family had insisted on for decades and the man who had denied them answers from the start. The hearing focused on forensic sequencing. The state opened with a detailed presentation of the skull identification process, the mitochondrial DNA match from the 2022 testing, and confirmation that the remains were indisputably Teresa's. The forensic anthropologist who reanalyzed the bone structure testified that the cranial fractures were consistent with blunt force trauma. No defensive injuries were observed, no perifractures, no breaks to the ulna or radius. But given the limited remains, absence wasn't proof of absence. Next came the terrain analysis. The lead forensic analyst outlined the mapping of the skull's recovery site and presented side-by-side images from 1997 and 2024. The burial depth, displacement patterns, and fabric fibers were used to argue one clear point. The remains had been deliberately hidden, not incidentally lost. The defense countered with procedural challenges. They questioned the chain of custody on the skull, from its 1997 recovery to the 2022 lab reprocessing. They argued that environmental decay could not definitively establish the time or cause of death. But what they didn't do was offer an alternative theory. The prosecution didn't rely on direct evidence. They didn't have it. They focused on probative weight, behavioral history, spatial proximity, and the absence of competing explanations. One by one, they layered Teresa's statements to friends, the witness descriptions of her final argument, the inconsistency in the suspect's timeline, and his quiet exit from Oregon less than a year after she disappeared. In cold cases, jurors aren't asked to decide based on emotion or imagination. They're asked to weigh probability. The prosecution leaned on this reality, showing that the timeline, geography, and forensic conditions surrounding Teresa's death aligned only with one logical conclusion: she hadn't vanished. She had been silenced. A retired investigator who worked on the original 1983 search was brought in for testimony. He confirmed that the area where the skull was later found had not been part of the initial search radius. At the time, they lacked resources and terrain access. That mistake, while not prosecutorial, reinforced the idea that someone knew where not to be found. By the end of the day, the judge determined that the state had met its burden. The case would proceed to trial. A tentative court date was set for November 2025. The courtroom emptied quietly. Outside, local press covered the moment with cautious headlines. The Peroni family didn't speak to media. They had waited 42 years. One more season was nothing. The justice system moved slowly, but in this case, it was finally moving forward. Not because of one discovery, but because of the slow accumulation of fact over time. Fact that finally outran denial. In early July 2025, the Monroe County Courthouse stood quieter than expected. The case of State of New York versus Dennis T. Bauer was set for trial in the fall, but the courthouse halls, once crowded with press in the wake of the 2023 indictment, had since emptied. This was no longer breaking news. The trial hadn't even begun, yet for those who had followed the 42-year-old cold case of Teresa Peroni, there was a quiet understanding. The justice system does not measure time the way grief does. Dennis Bauer, now 70, remained in custody at the Monroe County Jail, denied bail since his arrest. His arraignment and preliminary hearings in late 2023 and early 2024 had confirmed the prosecution's intent to pursue a second-degree murder charge. No body had ever been recovered in full, only a partial human skull identified as Teresa's through mitochondrial DNA. The skull, discovered in a ravine off a rural stretch of Bauer's former property, had been enough to breathe life back into a case that many believed would never find resolution. The upcoming trial, tentatively scheduled for November 2025, would hinge on a matrix of circumstantial evidence, forensic breakthroughs, and behavioral patterns pieced together across decades. No eyewitness had seen the act. There was no confession. But there were patterns: coercive control, physical abuse, isolation, financial entrapment. There was the recovered human remains, found in an area so remote and private that only someone familiar with the land would have chosen it. And there were the notebooks and letters Teresa had written in the weeks leading up to her disappearance, documents unearthed by her sister and preserved despite the years. The forensic pathologist was expected to testify on the skull's condition. No visible fractures, but degradation consistent with long-term environmental exposure. The prosecution would emphasize that the circumstances of Teresa's life, her attempts to leave, and her sudden disappearance without a trace pointed to only one plausible conclusion. In cases like this, it's not one smoking gun that matters. It's the accumulation of ash. Meanwhile, the defense filed motions to exclude Teresa's written materials as hearsay. They challenged the admissibility of the skull, arguing chain of custody issues from the original collection site in 2021. None of these arguments were likely to succeed, but they would prolong the legal process, a familiar tactic in delayed justice. Throughout the pretrial phase, Teresa's surviving family remained notably absent from the public eye. Her sister, who had long been her quiet advocate, declined interviews. One neighbor remarked that they've waited 40 years. They don't need to explain anything anymore. The sentiment echoed through local conversation. Closure may be a myth, but acknowledgement is not. There were no vigils this time, no news vans on the lawn, just paperwork, prep sessions, and an aging defendant whose face bore little resemblance to the man once suspected but never charged in 1982. Age had dulled the image but not the implications. The justice system, though slow, had not forgotten Teresa. In the community, the reopened case became a quiet reminder. People remembered Teresa as a woman who had tried to leave, tried to reclaim her life, but whose voice had been silenced. They remembered the years where no one could say for sure what had happened. They remembered the shift in 2021 when that silence finally broke, not through a dramatic confession or a sensational arrest, but through methodical search, persistent family, and forensic science. The Sheriff's Department emphasized that while not every cold case ends with an arrest, every unresolved case deserves the same scrutiny. Investigators spoke candidly about the lessons learned, the need to revisit old evidence with modern tools, to take seriously the testimony of women in abusive relationships, and to never consider a file closed simply because it's old. The courtroom is expected to be full when the trial begins. Teresa's name will be read into record once more. The jury will be shown a photograph of her from 1982, smiling, holding a coffee mug in a backyard that no longer exists. They'll hear about a man who once told police that his wife just walked out. They'll hear how no trace of her was found for decades, until it was. In the end, the outcome of the trial may not be the only thing that matters. The fact that the case was brought at all, that it forced the system to account for the voiceless, that it made space for a forgotten victim in the mechanism of justice, is a testament to what persistence can mean. Justice is not always swift, and it is rarely perfect. But when it comes, even after 40 years, it reaffirms something vital. The truth is still worth pursuing. Looking back on Teresa's story, I can't help but think about how many people live through quiet battles, unseen and unheard, until it's too late. If there's one thing this case taught me, it's that silence can be deadly, and that justice, no matter how long it takes, is always worth fighting for. If you ever feel trapped, unseen, or afraid, please don't wait for the world to notice. Speak up. Seek help. You matter. Now I want to hear from you. What part of this story resonated with you most? Have you or someone you know ever faced something similar? Drop your thoughts in the comments, or just let me know where you're watching from. If this story touched your heart, please like and share it. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next one. And hey, if you didn't like the video, I still want to know why. Your feedback matters.